All right, in today's video, we're going to talk about nucleic acids, the last final group of biomolecules. What elements make up nucleic acids? We have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now, what are the basic building blocks or subunit of nucleic acids? Well, they're the nucleotides. And how I remember this is nucleotides get tied together to form large nucleic acids, because nucleic acids are very large polymers. Now, what do these nucleotides look like? Well, and again, this is just a little cartoon representation, but this drawing has helped me understand and memorize this molecule over the last nearly 2 decades. Okay, so this is what a nucleotide would look like. And if you want to break it down, this is the sugar. And this little circle up here is the phosphate. And then this little rectangle would be the nitrogen base. So how are you going to remember this? Well, when I was about y'all's age, I thought, man, that kind of looks like a house. So I thought every sweet house, because this is actually a sugar, and we typically think of sugar as a sweet. Every sweet house is going to have a swimming pool, right? So we've got our phosphorus, or the P, and it's circular like a swimming pool, and a Nissan in the garage. And the only reason that Nissan came to mind is back in the day, I used to really like playing Gran Turismo, and one of the best cars in that game was the Nissan Skyline, right? And so we've got our sweet house, our swimming pool, and our Nissan in the garage. Well, really what that is the sugar, the phosphate, and the nitrogen base. And sometimes you'll see this nitrogen base referred to as a nucleobase, but it's simply a nitrogen-containing compound that behaves like a base. Now, what are their functions? So, a vast majority of the nucleic acids are going to be involved in genetic information, right? So our genes that are found in our DNA, since it's DNA, it's going to be made of many nucleotides, right? And so nucleic acids are involved in encoding, storing, transmitting, and expressing our genes. And they can also play a role in energy transfer. Certain nucleic acids can act like little batteries that get charged up and used in other parts of the cell for various functions. And some examples of these genetic related or gene carrying or transmitting or transcribing compounds are DNA and RNA, and then our little energy transferring battery, ATP, that we'll talk about here in just a second. Now, I'm going to show you guys a couple diagrams, okay? But don't worry too much. I'll make sure that you know what it is that you're responsible for. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So here we have a little bit more of a scientific, accurate depiction of our nucleotide, right? How do I recognize this? I always look for the little sweet house. We've got our swimming pool over here. You can see our phosphate and our Nissan in the garage, right? Our nitrogen, right? So we've got our sugar, our phosphate, and our nitrogen base. Well, in DNA and RNA, the nucleotides are almost the same, right? And so we look over here at DNA, right? We've got our sweet house, our pool, and our little garage. And in RNA, the nucleotides also have that sweet house, a phosphate, and our little car garage. But if you look very closely, the sugar in DNA is different. It's deoxyribose, and the sugar in RNA is ribose, and that's where they get their names: deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. And if you look over here, right, at the base, the nitrogen base, for DNA, you'll have A, G, C, and T. Whereas in RNA, we have A, G, C, and U, right? And so the major difference here between the DNA and RNA nucleotides would be that DNA would have T instead of U. U is found in RNA. And we'll go into greater detail as to what those letters actually stand for and the significance of those letters in both DNA and RNA when we get to that unit. Now, what are some other major differences between these two? Well, if we look at the structure of DNA, you can see that it is quite large and it's quite complicated, right? And so you've got two long chains that are kind of spiraling around each other, right? And so we would say DNA is a two or double-stranded molecule, and it has a double helix shape, kind of like a spiral staircase or a really, really fun roller coaster, right? So it's that double helix. So there's two strands, and then again, we've got the adenine, the guanine, the cytosine, and the thymine, A, G, C, and T. And then the sugar would be deoxyribose. So there's a nice little summation of the unique characteristics of DNA right there. And then if we look at RNA, you can see that a ribonucleic acid is only a single strand. And it has that sugar, ribose, and it has guanine, adenine, cytosine, and uracil instead. And you can kind of see right here that there's no T's present, right? There's no T, which is indicated as blue over here. I don't see any of those blue T's, right? Instead, I find a little orange uracil, which you don't see over here in DNA. So you got double-stranded, single-stranded, deoxyribose, ribose, AGC and T, AGC and U. Okay, now let's talk about ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So the triphosphate is telling us there's not one, but three phosphate groups here. So we can see our sugar, our ribose sugar, we've got our nitrogen base, and then we've got our three phosphates. Now ATP is a really important molecule for cellular energy, right? So our bodies actually use glucose, we break down glucose to charge or to power up ATP. So you kind of think about this as like a battery that is used by various proteins and parts of our cells to perform lots and lots of functions. Now, how does this work? Well, the energy is actually trapped right here between the phosphate bonds, right? These phosphate groups, there's bonds holding them together, and there's a lot of energy that gets stored there, right? And so when the cell needs some of that energy, all it needs to do is break off one of the phosphates and it releases energy, and that can power some kind of function. And then we are left with ADP, and the D being diphosphate. And this could happen again, right? Knock another phosphate off, and we'll be left with AMP, or adenosine monophosphate. And for our bodies to recharge ATP, all we need to do is take something like ADP, adenosine diphosphate, glue on an extra phosphate, right, which absorbs the energy or stores the energy in those bonds for later. So you can kind of look at these phosphates like the 3 bars and maybe the battery of your phone, right? And you can see when it's fully charged, you got all 3 bars. And as you use the energy from your cell battery or your cell phone battery, you end up with 2 bars instead of 3, and then 1 bar, eventually maybe none. And then when you plug that battery back in, it gets charged back up, right? And so our cells use ATP to drive a lot of cellular functions. Well, that's all I have for today. I hope that wasn't too much. Go back and make sure to look at the diagram that compares DNA and RNA, and I'll see you guys soon.